Welcome back, friends. Dan Vega here, and today we're going to talk about building your first Spring application. But there's a little catch. Today, we're not going to use Spring Boot. Now, why would we do that? Stick around, and I'll tell you all about it right after this. All right, so as I said in the intro, today we're going to be building a Spring application, but we're not going to use Spring Boot. And there are a couple reasons behind this. First of all, Spring Boot does a lot for you. And if you're not really sure of how Spring works, then some of it can be a little bit magic. And so what I want to dive into is just build a simple Spring application. We'll start by using a Maven project. You can use any IDE you like. I'll be using IntelliJ today. But what we'll do is we'll start from a simple Maven project, add the dependencies that we need, and that will really allow us to focus in on the basics of the Spring application or the Spring framework. And so we'll look at things like dependency injection and configuration. And I think it'll give you an appreciation for just how Spring applications are built. And then once you get into Spring Boot applications, you'll start to notice some of these things that Spring has done for you. I mean, one of the biggest things that we're not going to get into today is if you try to build an MVC application, there are a lot of things and configurations and plumbing that goes into that. And Spring Boot really just gives us a lot of this out of the box. So that's why I wanted to do this. I've gotten a lot of questions regarding this, so it should be a fun one. And what are we waiting for? Let's go ahead and just jump right in and start building this app. All right, so the first step to creating your very first Spring application is to create the project. To do so, I'm going to be using IntelliJ's Ultimate Edition today, but you do not need this version to go ahead and follow along. If you want to grab the Community Edition, that will work just as fine. You can also use something like VS Code or Eclipse or NetBeans, whatever your favorite IDE is. Ultimately, what we are doing today is we're creating a new Maven project. From there, we'll add some dependencies and we'll write some code. So here in IntelliJ, I'm going to click on New Project and we're going to bring this up. And what we want to do, again, is we are creating a new Maven project. So there is a Spring initializer in here, and that is for creating a Spring Boot application. If you're interested in that, I have a ton of tutorials on Spring Boot. I'll go ahead and link a playlist up above and down below in the description. But this is just getting started with Maven, or getting started with Spring using the Maven new project. So we are not going to create an archetype. You can go ahead and choose whatever project SDK you like. I'm going to use Java 16. If you are going to use Java 16, make sure you're up to date on your version of IntelliJ. If not, any other version's fine. 11, 8, doesn't really matter for this specific project. So I'm going to click Next. And what we're going to do is we're going to throw something here in my Spring folder. We'll call this Hello Spring. And here in the artifact coordinates, I'm going to go ahead and set up dev.danvega. We'll call this Hello Spring. And I'm going to just make sure that directory is empty. Okay, now it should be. Let's go ahead and click Finish. And this is going to open up our project. I'm going to go ahead and maximize this. Okay, so everything's kind of done. This will start up real fast because there really isn't much to this application right now. So the first thing that we want to do is we need to add any dependencies. So if we look in main, there's just a Java and a resources folder. We look in tests, there's a Java folder. This is what you get. This is kind of the plumbing out of the box when you create a Maven project. And the Maven project also gives us this pom.xml where we get to kind of declare some of the properties and dependencies about our project. So you'll see some properties here right away. We've just stated that we're using Java 16 here. So that was part of the kind of wizard, and it wrote that for us. Again, next what we want to do is we want to define what dependencies we need. So we need some outside code to go ahead and start our project. And to do that, we're just going to create a dependencies block. And you see as I start typing, I get some code assist here, which is really nice. So then in dependencies, I'm going to add a new dependency. So the first dependency that we need is Spring Context. So again, we're getting that assist here. Just one of the many reasons I really love IntelliJ. We kind of get that help there. So if I hit enter, it will go ahead and suggest some groups. That is in fact org.springframework, and the latest version is 5.3.5. Now, if you're brand new to Maven, don't worry about it. That is really the gist of what you need to know for today's tutorial. But if we go ahead and click save, you see this little circle up here, basically says, hey, I've noticed you've changed the pom.xml. You want to go ahead and load those changes. And we do, so I'm going to click that. And if I pull over this Maven dialog here, again, if you're using another ID, don't worry about this. I'm just kind of doing this to explain something. But our dependency that we put in here was Spring Context. So what it will show you below is that there are some transitive dependencies on Spring Context. Now, in order to have that, we need Spring ALP, we need Spring Beans, we need Spring Core, and we need Spring Expression. So by declaring that one dependency, we've kind of brought all of these other dependencies with us. And we can double check that here. If we look under external libraries, you'll see all the libraries that we have brought into our project. So that's really all we need to get going. Now we can go ahead and start writing some code. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and close this down. Under Java, we're going to create a default package here. So we're going to say new package. This is going to be dev.danvega. Inside of there, I'm going to create a new class and call it application. So in application, we need to set up a public static void main. And let's just go ahead and print hello spring. And what we're doing here is we just want to make sure our application runs, everything works without error before we go ahead and add any kind of business logic to our application. So there we go. We have hello spring. If you didn't see what I did there, there's a little play button next to that method or the class. You can click on that to run it. You can also right click and go to run application. You can also come up here to run and run application, and you see the keyboard shortcut for your OS there. So that's kind of the plumbing. Now what we need to do is start talking about how we're going to build this system out. So this system that we're going to build is going to be based on courses. I've used this kind of domain before, but what if I was building a course platform where I wanted to be able to sell courses? So at the very minimum, the first thing I'm going to need is a model package. And what we're going to do inside of here is create a course.java. And this course is going to represent a single course in our system. What are the different properties of a course? So I'm going to come in here and say that we may have an integer course ID. We may have a title. We may have a description. We may have a link to the course. So in a real world scenario, there's going to be a lot more involved in this, but you can start with this. You don't need to build out your entire model to begin with. I really like to start MVP, minimum viable product, and work from there. So we'll start with this. I'm going to create a few more things. I'm going to create a constructor that takes all of these in as arguments. I'm also going to create getters and setters for each of these. And finally, I'm going to create a toString, and that is all we need for course. So now that we have a model, we need to come up with a system where we can store these models, right? And this would usually belong in some type of service class. So what I want to do is actually create a new, let's say, package, and we'll call this service. And inside the service class, I'm going to create an interface called CRUD service. So anytime I create a service that is basically used for CRUD, create, read, update, and delete, I'm going to have an interface for this. And this interface is going to be based on a type of T. So that means when we create a new course service, it'll basically implement this CRUD service, and that type of T is now the course. If we add something later on, like a user, that will be a user type. And this just allows us to avoid duplication of all these different, instead of creating, say, a course CRUD service interface and a user CRUD service interface, this will kind of clean that up. So the first thing we want is probably a list of that type. We'll call that list. We also want to return that type when we create one. We might want an optional of that type. We'll call it get, which will take an integer. Again, this is assuming every type in our application is of type integer, but for this case, it'll work fine. We want to update tt int id, and we want to delete int id. So that's really it. And what we're going to do now is just create a Java class here called course service, which we are going to implement CRUD service of course. And we're going to go ahead and implement those methods to satisfy that contract. All right, so now what we need is when we call this list, we need a way to return a list of courses. So what I'm going to do is create an instance variable here that is a list of courses. We'll call this courses. And maybe in the constructor, I'll just go ahead and set these. So eventually we're going to move this into a repository class, and ultimately, this would be something that pulls from the database. But right now, what I just want to do is say courses is equal to new array list, and I should spell that right. And what we're going to do is we'll just create a new course. So let's say a course Spring Boot is equal to new course. Say getting started with Spring Boot 2, which is a course of mine. How to build real applications with Spring Boot 2. And the link will be there. Okay, so now what we can do, one thing I like about IntelliJ here is I can come in here and get this little help and say, I like to put these on separate lines just to clean that up. So now with a single course ready, I can say courses.add Spring Boot, and that should be it. So now when this CRUD service starts, we have this list of courses. We create one on the constructor, and guess what? We're going to go ahead and return this. So again, we're going to kind of add on to this application, but I want to start small just to kind of walk through each step. So now back in our application, what if we wanted to go ahead and print out all of those courses? Well, what we could do is we can create a new course service, and we can say, all right, service, please go ahead and get all of those instances for us. So when we create this new course service, that one will get created. And then what we can do is just say service.list. And this should go ahead and print out that one course to the console. So it did. So in a very simplistic world, this will work fine. Now, when we start building real-world applications, though, Anytime you kind of see yourself newing up instances of a class, especially in the Spring world, this is a no-no. This is because we want Spring to manage those instances for us. And there are a lot of reasons behind this, one of which you don't want to have that tight coupling between classes. So Spring is going to help us with that because we aren't, anytime that we have to change it, then we don't have to go ahead and if that constructor were to change, we'd have to go everywhere in our application and change where we've kind of created a new instance of it, especially if we overrode that and didn't have the default NOR constructor anymore. Another thing that it's going to help us with is when we get into, especially on the web side, when we are creating dependencies in our controllers, those are basically called every time a request happens. So in that case, we'd be creating many, many instances of a single class that doesn't need instances. So it's going to help us there as well. All right, so then the question is, if you aren't going to just new up a new instance of the course service, how do you get an instance of it? And this is where configuration comes in. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we need to tell Spring about the classes that we want Spring to manage for us. And so there are several ways to do this. If you've kind of looked around online and seen old examples, this used to be XML based. You can do this through a Java configuration these days. You can also, as we'll see later in this tutorial, skip configuration altogether by using annotations. But let's start with the config approach. And what we're going to do is create a new package here called config. And in here, we're going to go ahead and create something called app config. Again, this could be called whatever you want it to be. So in here, the important part of this is we're going to mark this with an @configuration annotation. And so if we click into this, and let's pull that down, and take a look at just exactly what is going on here. This indicates that a class declares one or more @bean methods and may be processed by the Spring container to generate bean definitions and service requests for those beans at runtime. So here's an example. So when you say @bean, so bean is really a class that the Spring container is going to manage for us. So when you're marked that with @bean, Spring is going to know, hey, I have this thing called my bean, and whenever you ask for one, I can go ahead and give you one. And so that's what we want to do here with our service. So we're going to say @bean, we're going to say public course service, we'll say get course service is the name, and all we're going to do is return new course service, and that's it. So now you're probably thinking, well, what's the difference with that, Dan? You just said not to use new course service. Well, I did, but I said don't tie yourself to that instantiation over in our main application class. You have to do that somewhere, but here we're only doing it in one place. So if anything changes there with that contract, you only have to update it in one place. So now, back in our application, instead of saying new course service, we're going to do a couple different things. So let's get rid of this. The first thing that we need to do is we need to set up that what's called an application context. And it's really, well, actually, we'll dive into that. Let's say application context. Now that is an interface. And the class that we're going to use for this case is the annotation config application context. And we're going to point to our appconfig.class. So that is probably going to need, whoops. Okay. So let's talk about this for a second. So again, this is the interface. This is an interface, the central interface to provide configuration for an application. This is the actual class that we're going to use to work with. This is the implementation. So standalone application context, accepting component classes as input. So we'll see more of how this works in a second. So now that we have that instance, what we can do is we can ask for a reference to that course service, because Spring now has an idea of where your configuration is, right? And it's going to say, all right, I'm going to go ahead and create a type course service bean for you. So we can just go ahead and ask for it now. So we can say we want something of type course service. We'll call it service. But now, instead of new, we're just going to say, hey, application context, go ahead and get me a bean. The name is going to be course service. And the type is going to be course service.class. So now we should be able to just go ahead and say service.list, just like we did before. Let's go ahead and run this. And could not find a bean named course service. So all we need to do over here is actually give it a name. So we're going to say course service, and that's how we refer to that specific bean. We refer to it as a course service. So back in our application, that is the name that we are using to reference that bean. So if we go ahead and run it again, we see our one course there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and improve on this application a little bit. Here in our course service, we have our instance variable for our list of courses, and in the constructor, we're creating just a single course. Now, in the real world, we don't want to do this type of work in a service. This is going to be delegated to something like a DAO or a repository. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new package here, and we're going to call this repository. And in this repository, I am going to create an interface called CRUD repository. And in here, we are going to create a single list of T. We need that. So similar to what we did with the service, our repository is going to have one method called findAll. Next, what I want to do is create a new course repository. And that is going to implement the CRUD repository for course. Again, we're going to implement these methods. And so far, nothing's really changed. The next thing that I want to do is over in a course service, I want to kind of get rid of the logic inside of here. So let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. Now this is going to throw an error because we no longer have courses in here. And what I'll do is inside of our findAll method here, I'll kind of just replace that logic. So this allows us to, again, we're just using an in-memory representation of a list, and we're adding one course to it, and we're returning that. Now, we would probably make that an instance variable, just like we did in the service class before. But again, this is just a demo, so I want to try and keep this as simple as possible. So here we're going to return that. So now what I need to do is I need that course repository here in my service. So I might say something like course repository. We'll just call this a repository. Again, I need an instance of this, so I might say repository is equal to new course repository. And now I can use this to go ahead and find all. So now back in my application, if I run this, everything should work as it did before. But of course, you probably already see the problem here, is in our service, we are going ahead and we're creating a new course repository. And we don't want to do this. We want Spring to manage this class for us. So how can we fix that? Well, we can go back over to our app config. And what we need to do is create a new bean. So let's say @bean, and this is going to be called course repository. I don't know why I always misspell that. We're going to say public course repository is going to be get course repository. Return new course repository. Okay, so this is going to work. But now if we look in our course service, we don't want to new this up, right? What we want is we want this constructor to accept an argument of type course repository. And then that way we would just set this .repository equal to course repository. And actually the name isn't the same, so that should work. So now this is what we want, but we do have one related problem here, and that is back here, when we create our new course service, we need to get an instance of the course repository. And to do that, all we need to do is say get course repository, and there we go. So now that should satisfy this argument. And of course, if we go ahead and run this, everything should work as we expect. Okay, so application's looking pretty good right now, but I just want to show you one final way you can start to clean some of this up. And again, this is going to start to make more sense, especially if you get into Spring Boot work, of what is actually happening behind the scenes. And that's why I really like to kind of show this stuff. Not that I think you would write applications this way from scratch, but really just to understand Spring and why it's important to you, what it's useful for, and what is kind of happening behind the scenes when things start to get a little more complicated. So back in our app config, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just comment these out as if they don't exist. So now there's going to be some problems in our application because in our application, when we try to go get a course service, that is not going to exist, and there is no course repository either. So we're going to have some problems. So you don't need to manually create all of these beans unless you have a reason to. If you have some like extra configuration or logic that you want to add in here, there's not a lot of reason to do this. So we can go ahead and simplify this. If we go over to course service, what we want to do is, I'm just going to clean up these imports. So we can add a special annotation to these classes. The biggest one is @component, and there are specialized versions of this annotation for things like services and repositories. So we're going to add @service. And if we look at this, we can say this is really just an @component underneath the hood. And so an @component indicates that this class is a component. Such classes are considered as candidates for auto detection when using annotation-based configuration and class path scanning. So this is going to be important. So now in our repository, we're going to add one more called a repository. So again, that is a specialized component. They're all @component annotations. So that is going to add this to the application context for us. So now in our app config, all we have to do is say, we need to tell our configuration where to look for our classes. So we're going to say @component scan, and I'm going to say dev.danvega is the main package that I want you to look in. So now it's going to search down that package for classes that are marked with either @component, @service, @controller, @rest controller, @repository. It's going to look for these components and add them to the application context for us. So now if we come back over here and we go ahead and run this, we should see that it works just fine, and that cleans up our code a lot. So I think that is the extent of it. That's really what I wanted to show you today. And again, this is going to help you understand dependency injection, how this, why the Spring framework is so useful. But more importantly, that when you spin up a new Spring Boot application, there's a lot going on there. It adds so much, it makes things so much easier for us. But lost in that shuffle could be, what the foundation is, what is actually happening underneath the hood. And this is really the basics, the basis for that whole framework, being able to manage dependencies like this and so much more. But just thought I'd show you this. Hope to kind of shed some light on what's happening there in the Spring framework. So I think that is where we'll end today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found value in this, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Give me a thumbs up. And as always, friends, happy coding.